Question for believers is, what do we tune our lives to? What is it when I'm looking at all these things and I've got 20 news channels flying at me? How do I decide what's right, what's wrong, what's real, what's not real? I got to tune to something. Well, if I tune to the news channels, I'm going to be some kind of messed up. But I got to tune to the Word of God. It never changes. The one constant in our lives. So for Christian believers, finding a biblical perspective on the world that we're living in is the only way that we're really going to survive and not go completely crazy. I think we grew up at a time when people thought their church life was over here and the rest of their life was somewhere else.
Okay.
And the two didn't really mix. So you'd see what I'd call the Saturday night Christian and the Sunday morning Christian. Same person, very different lifestyle. And so people could compartmentalize their faith from everything else they did, whether it was their work or their education or their social relationships or their maybe their hobbies or activities. As we've matured in faith, I'd like to believe that we've come to understand that Jesus is Lord of all,
Yes. Okay.
Not just our Sunday schedule, and that our faith is not like a sweater that we put on a cold day and then take it off as soon as the weather warms up, but that we wear it all the time, that it's not from the outside in, it's from the inside out. That's why a program like Centerpoint that integrates the world events, the things that are happening around us with faith, how do we interpret it? How do we apply it? How do we need to see it as believers? And it's not to try to say, this is what you have to think. Not at all. It's to say, let's take the biblical standard and let's apply it. And I'll give you a great analogy from my standpoint as a musician. Before you play an instrument, you have to tune it. And if you don't tune it, I don't care how great a musician you are, it's a train wreck when you try to play a song in an untuned instrument. Question is, what do you tune it to? You tune it to a fixed, rigid scale that never changes. And if you tune a guitar in Tokyo, it's the same tuning mechanism that you would do in Toledo. No difference, because that's how you play a song. Question for believers is, what do we tune our lives to? What is it when I'm looking at all these things and I've got 20 news channels flying at me? How do I decide what's right, what's wrong, what's real, what's not real? I got to tune to something. Well, if I tune to the news channels, I'm going to be some kind of messed up. But I got to tune to the Word of God. It never changes. The one constant in our lives. So for Christian believers, finding a biblical perspective on the world that we're living in is the only way that we're really going to survive and not go completely crazy.
Gov, you're a broadcaster, communicator, media person. You've been a politician. You've been a pastor. Go back in your earlier days a little bit and describe to us why the church back in the day avoided current events and why we feel kind of obliged to deal with them now.
Part of it was fear that there would be possibility somebody would be offended, fear that it would maybe cost attendance or offerings, to be blunt. Nickels and noses were what church were all about. I mean, you just got to be honest. That's really kind of what people thought. But I also believe that there was this attitude, a prevailing attitude, that churches don't need to get involved. And they would say in politics. Now, if by that you mean partisan, hardcore politics, I'd agree with that. You don't want to use your pulpit to endorse candidates and to turn it into a political organization. But the point is, the church got to where it wouldn't speak to the issues of the day.
Right.
Church ought to be speaking to the issue of race. The church ought to be speaking to the issue of marriage and life. Because if we don't, who is? And if we don't bring it with a biblical perspective, then we've basically surrendered to the secular perspective, which is never going to be an accurate portrayal of what marriage ought to look like, or what life ought to be viewed to be, or what even charity and humanitarianism ought to look like. Where does that all come from?
Yeah.
Comes from a biblical perspective, a relationship with Christ. So that's why when we're talking about the integration of faith with the rest of our lives, Centerpoint is the natural place for TBN to go to say, you're going to get content that is professional journalism delivered with an objectivity that journalism ought to have. Let you make your decisions about how you feel about it, but the application of it, we unapologetically will tell you, has a biblical perspective, and we'll never back away from that.